Welcome to the second day of our international conference on digital governance in the times of COVID-19. This conference is jointly organized by the Bar-Ilan University Faculty of Law and the Jean Monnet Center for Excellence on Digital Governance. My name is Ittai Bar-Siman-Tov, and I'm the head of the BIU Innovation Lab for Law, Data Science, and Digital Ethics at Bar-Ilan University Faculty of Law, and a senior fellow at the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence on Digital Governance. Our first panel today deals with virtual parliaments during COVID-19. COVID-19 has been a unique challenge for legislatures because legislatures, their very operation is dependent on assembling many lawmakers in one room to debate and vote. And such an assembly of many people is of course challenged by the health risk of a highly contagious pandemic, and also by the social distancing measures that most countries around the world adopted, which commonly also include prohibitions on gatherings. And one of the interesting things that we've seen throughout the world during the pandemic is that that one of the most important developments that allowed parliaments to continue to operate is implementing digital solutions such as video conferencing, remote voting, etc. And this is a fascinating development because parliaments are often considered to be traditionalist institutions that are very reluctant and slow to change their procedures and particularly to adopt digital tools. So today we'll hear about the challenges of going virtual for parliaments, the opportunities, the dangers, and also the lessons that we can already learn from a specific case study on the subject. And we're fortunate to have with us today a very distinguished panel of experts on the subject. Introducing their full bios and achievements would take up all our time. So I will only briefly introduce each of our panelists before each of their presentations. Each presentation will be 20 minutes, followed by discussion of 10 minutes. All the attendees are very much encouraged to write questions for the panelists in the Q&A function. And of course, panelists are also encouraged to ask questions and interact with each other. So let us begin. Our first speaker is Professor Cristina Leston-Bandeira. She is Professor of Politics at the University of Leeds, Chair of UK Study of Parliament Group, Co-Director of Center for Democratic Engagement, and co-editor of the Journal Parliamentary Affairs. She also served on the Digital Democracy Commission set up by the Speaker of the House of Commons. Just as an anecdote, before our meeting today, I went back and looked at your recommendations from 2015, and it was funny to see that one of the recommendations was that by 2020, Parliament will go fully digital. So little do they know what would happen 5 years later, right? Going back to introducing Cristina, her research focuses on relationship between parliament and citizens, particularly public and digital engagement. And the title of her talk is The Challenges of Being a Virtual Parliament. Cristina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ittai, for the invitation to be here and for the introduction. It is interesting to go back to that report now and to look at it with the eyes from 2020, 2021, and what we know now and what we knew then. And what I'd like to suggest to do with my talk, because I saw that Olivier Rosenberg was also talking in this panel, and I didn't really want to overlap with his talk. So what I'm proposing to do is to take a step back and reflect a little bit about the nature of a parliament, the nature of a literature, and what is it about it that makes it an institution where it is difficult to implement digital solutions, just like you said in your introduction, because they are different institutions from, say, a government institution or local government or even a political party. And excuse me, and by doing that reflection, then at the end of that, I want to come back to COVID and see what has COVID actually created in terms of reaction, in terms of actions from Parliament, which is very unique. We needed a crisis for something like this to happen. So in terms of those characteristics of literatures, I've outlined this in a number of different publications, about 7 key characteristics of literatures that make these institutions particularly difficult bedfellows with digital, particularly difficult to install digital in these environments. And you'll see that a lot of these characteristics are characteristics that lead parliaments to take slow, decision-making processes, and being very risk-averse. And as we know, digital thrives on risk. Digital thrives on innovation, experimentation, etc. And that's the thing that parliaments don't do very well. So why is that? Rather than people, parliaments are often seen as, the bad one in around, and people are very quick to criticize parliaments and institutions. But these characteristics apply to any parliament, really, not just a single one. So the first one I want to talk about is the fact that they are collective bodies. So if you think about that, they are institutions that bring together different players, different groups. There isn't one single one that leads it, contrary to government. So in government, you have one group, the people in power, who will lead that program, who will lead a manifesto. Even if you have coalition, they are brought together by a manifesto who will lead. Whereas a parliament has lots of different groups in there, and all of that gets in the way of quick decision making, quick decisions, or even just taking those decisions, because all the different parts have to be heard. Then the second characteristic is the fact, and it's linked with the first one, is the fact that we have differing and often opposing agendas within the same institution. So we have lots of groups within one institution, within the same place, who actually want very different things and who may be opposing to each other. We have political groups who, in some cases, are incredibly competitive in relation to the other groups. They're all after the same thing. They all want to be in power. So not only they want different things for the institution, so it's difficult to move it forward, but also they will always be only too happy to point out what a group has done which they disagree with, or to bring it to the media. And that again brings difficulties in terms of deciding how to move forward an institution like Parliament. You even have parliaments that have groups within those parliaments who think the Parliament shouldn't exist. Like the European Parliament is full of those people who think the European Parliament shouldn't exist. The UK Parliament has a nationalist group also who also thinks that Scotland shouldn't respond to Westminster. So when you have those groups who are against each other, and in some cases actually against the actual institution, again, it becomes very difficult to manage that public image and take decisions. And that has implications to digital because digital requires much quicker type of decisions. And we'll come to that as I move along in my argument. And then the third one, and again linked to this too, is the lack of a single voice. So if you think about it, no one speaks for Parliament. There isn't a single person that speaks for Parliament. You might have presidents of Parliament, speakers, presiding officers that sort of represent Parliament and can speak for Parliament. But even those, they don't speak for that collective. They don't speak for that multiplicity of different people. And that impacts on leadership. And if you know anything about leadership, you know that leadership needs to have one voice, one image, one message. And again, that hinders decisions to do with digital and experimentation, risk, and all of that. And then the fourth characteristic is the fact that these are bicephalous leaderships that parliaments have. So bicephalous meaning with two heads, two channels, two structures. You have the political leadership and you have the administrative leaderships. And often these two leaderships are actually in tension between themselves and they want different things. So you may have political leaderships who want to move forward very quickly, who want to make Parliament very modern and very in contact with the public, etc. And then you may have administrative leaderships who may be wiser about some of the decisions because they've been there for a longer time and be more cautious in those decisions. But you may also have the other way around. You may also have administrative leaderships who actually want to move forward. They know how to innovate, but politicians, the political leaderships may not want to do it because they know they'll have elections in 6 months' time or in 3 weeks' time, and they're worried about the backlash that will have on them. So the political are the temporary leaderships. The admin are the permanent leaderships. I usually call them the guardians of the institution. And these tensions, again, creates difficulties of how to move forward. And it's interesting because when we look at different parliaments, but in the UK Parliament in particular, over the last year, the number of decisions that the admin staff is trying to move forward, but always trying to fit in with the political decisions from the government side, really in particular, whilst the opposition is criticizing all those decisions, in terms of voting, in terms of participation in debates. And that tension it's constantly there. But it's when that tension doesn't exist that actually things move forward and you have better solutions suitable for a wider range of people. And then the fifth characteristic is the visibility. And again, we often say that parliaments are very closed and opaque and you don't know what's happening in there, but I invite any of you to go and try to find out what any government is doing, or who are the people who work in government, or even other types of, similar institutions. Even I know you're talking about tribunals and courts today. Again, go to those. And actually, parliaments are incredibly visible. They're often the image that people associate. In terms of political institutions, they are the most visible institutions we have. And often people will be able to recognize the picture of a parliament building. They might not realize it's parliament. They might think it's government. They might think it's other things, but they will recognize that. And often the media will use those images too. And anything that happens there, actually, because there's all those different groups within it also who also use the media, tends to be very visible. And that's great to a large extent in terms of transparency, but it also brings vulnerability to the institution. Again, it makes that risk averse become even higher, because the leaderships know that if they spend, say, some money on a digital solution, that someone will find out how much money they spent on that. They might be in the news straight away if that didn't work. Whereas you might get away with that to a larger extent if you are in a different political institution. Whereas in Parliament, there's always too often too many people who are really very ready to show where things have gone wrong. And then the sixth characteristic, and this links specifically to my area of research. So my area of research, as you said, Ittai, it links very much to the relationship with citizens. So I'm less I work less on the digital aspects of parliaments in terms of the technicalities of it, but how parliaments use digital to engage with the public. And one of the problems which derives from the characteristics of parliaments is that parliaments, or staff within parliaments who do this digital engagement day in, day out, if it's done by staff, it is an apolitical voice. It's not the political voice. Politicians obviously can talk about politics, and that's what they do day in, day out. That's their job. And they can give opinions about this and that. So MPs, parliamentarians, representatives, they are obviously political people. But quite often parliaments have digital channels, so say, for instance, social media or even just websites, whatever those digital outputs may be. And those tend to be non-political, because they have to be, because parliamentary staff need to be unbiased at all points, at any time. And that means that it's actually really difficult then to engage the public, because the public, they don't engage by through the beauty of being in politics. Only people who enjoy politics, which is not many. I always say to my students that they're not normal. The fact that they are there doing politics straight away makes them not normal. Most people don't really care about politics. They care about issues. They feel really strongly about issues. And so from the moment you start discussing political issues, there has to be some political content in there. And quite often staff, parliamentary officials really struggle to do that, because they can't give a view on anything, which this is one of the reasons why many of parliamentary social media channels tend to be very bland, very neutral, because of that concern of not emitting any opinions. But that has consequences in terms of digital engagement. And then my last point, the seventh one, is that we only have a few and far between parliaments across the world or in any country. So if you think about it, unless you are maybe a federation where you may have sub-state, state legislatures, like say in Australia, in Brazil, in Canada, you usually only have one example of one parliament in one country. And actually lesson learning between parliaments is really, really difficult. And there are international organizations like the IPU, etc., who try to do that lesson learning, but that is really not seemingly. Whereas you can get lesson learning between political parties, even between different types of courts within the country, between legislatures is far more difficult. And that matters in particular with digital, because it doesn't necessarily fit with the institution of parliament so well. And come back combining that with a lack of experimentation, the fact that parliaments do not experiment necessarily with different things because they are risk averse, it means that that lesson learning is very difficult to happen. And then if you bring in, different cultures, different political systems, different languages, then it makes all of this even more difficult. And why does all of this matter? All of this matters because all of these characteristics explain why legislatures, parliaments have very slow decision-making processes in terms of changing anything in there. And this matters obviously to anything to do with innovation, and digital is about innovation for legislature. And so that's why they tend to be quite slow in this area. It also means all these characteristics, it explains why they're so risk averse, why they don't experiment, why they don't do small pilots, for instance. And in my research, that it's very clear that the parliaments who have been more innovative in terms of using digital tools or have done more things are the ones who have had experimentation or have had ways of bringing that innovation up. And so, the case of the Congress in Brazil is often cited, and it is, I'd say, the most digitized parliament you'd find. But that's because it's been happening for a very long time. So when COVID-19 happened, it's no surprise at all that this was one of the first parliaments that moved everything online. Because it's one of those parliaments also that has a way of dealing with innovation. So the sort of parliaments that have moved more forward are the ones who try to experiment. In a Brazilian case, for instance, they have a process whereby staff themselves, they can bring in innovation projects, so they can bring the project and experiment. So the institution itself encourages that. And today, the platform of e-democracy, for instance, which has lots of multiplicities involved in it, came out of one of those projects. And then there's another thing behind it, which is the political leadership, because obviously staff, there's those tensions where staff can't really take those decisions ultimately. So the political leadership really, really matters in this. And for instance, the European Parliament, when they decided to experiment and really invest in social media, that was because of the composition of the leadership in terms of the bureau and the fact that they do have vice presidents within the Parliament with specific portfolios in different areas. And they felt very much very strongly trying to increase the turnout, trying to increase the involvement of public. I'd argue that that may not necessarily actually be very realistic, but that's the political decision that made the investment in that area. So what happened with COVID? With COVID, we have something interesting, which is all these conditions are still there. They haven't changed. We're still the same institutions. But what we have is a situation of crisis. So I think that the reaction to COVID, it's not necessarily just about digitalization and about virtual. It's also a case of a crisis, how to react to a crisis. And on the face of crisis, we've seen parliaments actually bringing very innovative processes coming through. And sometimes some of these are actually the simplest ones that you can find. So what I found interesting is that those parliaments that are most digitalized, and I'll put the Brazilian Congress in that, are not necessarily always the ones that have done the most innovative approaches to COVID or innovative approaches to engagement with the public. For instance, in the case of Brazil, I don't know if you know about this, but in their parliamentary committees, they usually have these interactive hearings where the public can put questions live as a committee is taking place. And then those questions are put forward to the people, in that hearing. Whereas with COVID, there's basically closed committees, or they have, ad hoc committees. With those committees not being happening, that means that one digital sort of more participatory type of instrument that was there, that was a bit more fluid than others, has just disappeared. It's not there. On the other hand, you have an institution like the Canadian House, which is quite traditional in lots of ways. And I wouldn't say it's one of the most digitalized by any means, but they actually saw the virtual means, specifically with committees, which are much more flexible, of course, to work or to bring any changes. And they saw that as an opportunity to actually listening much more to the public. So they've done lots of different hearings for, in lots of different types of situations to try to understand actually how was COVID affecting the country itself. And And basically, it's just a Zoom link, isn't it? It's nothing complicated. It's just that. But it's about thinking, how can, in a situation of crisis, trying to make the most of the tools available to reach out to the people. And in the UK Parliament, you've seen also something similar in that, again, the most innovative aspects have been through committees. And again, if we come back to the characteristics I was referring to before, it's only natural that it happens around committees, because around committees, it's a smaller group. It's smaller people. Quite often, it's actually a much more consensual type of group. So it's easier to make decisions and to implement this quickly. And again, in the UK House of Commons, where we've seen the most innovation has been at the committee level, where you've had committees doing hearings like we're doing now using Zoom, and bringing in actually members of the public, citizens, not interest groups, citizens, talking about a variety of issues. From benefits, pensions to health issues. One example, which has been really interesting, is the UK Parliament has got a petitions committee, which has done lots throughout the COVID period, and the petitions have gone, 3 times higher the number, etc. And there was a petition about maternity leave and how people who were expecting a baby, or families expecting a baby, were affected by COVID because, the father couldn't go with them to hospital, the mums were not getting the support from hospitals, and that sort of thing. And that led to a number of hearings with actual, mums and dads who were being affected by those issues, which then led to questions to the Prime Minister and led to changes in the government. So there's been some really interesting solutions happening. But I come back to my point before that a lot of these have happened because of situation of crisis and people thinking of simple solutions. And actually, it's quite often the simple solutions, it's what leads to the most interesting type of results. And what I found interesting is to see institutions like the Brazilian Congress, which has a lot to go for it, and it's got lots of really good, interesting and innovative practice happening in there. Although they did go, fully digitally very quickly, on the other hand, they actually didn't necessarily follow through with proper engagement with the public in that country. And that's me. 20 minutes.
Perfect, thank you very much. So I encourage the attendees to start writing questions in the Q&As. And meanwhile, I'll get us started with 2 questions, if I may. First, you briefly mentioned the UK Parliament, and I think the UK Parliament is very interesting. One, because it's considered one of the most traditionalist institutions, and headed by, at least the House, headed by a very traditional, self-proclaimed traditionalist chair. And also that because it had various responses throughout the pandemic. It started by taking an extended Easter break, and then it went semi-virtual. And then they decided, well, let's go back from being virtual and be, physical, etc. So if you want to say a bit more about the UK, I'd be very interested. So this is the first question. And the second question was very interesting what you said about Brazil. And I think Brazil is a fascinating question. And as you said, it's a very interesting example of how the ability of parliaments in advance and the extent they were digitalized before COVID-19 had a very big impact. But I'm wondering, maybe we can learn another, a more broader lesson, because maybe 2 other factors are in play here. One is the size of the country. In some countries, getting the parliament members together is not that difficult. For example, in Israel, which is quite small. In Brazil, with traveling restrictions, etc., might be the only solution to go digital. And the other thing is maybe the health crisis that was, of course, one of the most severe was in Brazil. So I wonder if that can tell us something broader of which parliaments went virtual more or less. So I'll stop here, and a very fascinating talk. I can ask a lot more, but I'll stop here and wait for Q&As from the audience as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ittai. Yeah, I mean, the UK case is really, really interesting, and we could write the whole book. In fact, I don't know if you know about it, but you mentioned at the beginning that I'm chair of the UK Study of Parliament group. And I know you've been involved yourselves, you and Olivier, in publications about parliaments and COVID. But in the Study of Parliament group, we did a publication about how the UK Parliament adapted to the pandemic. I don't know if you know about that. I can put the link in a chat in a minute.
Yeah, great idea.
And so what's happened in the UK, it's really typical of those tensions between, there's so many different tensions in there. There is a tension between the traditionalists and the modernists, which has been the UK Parliament for a very long time. And as you say, we just happen to have now the leader of the House. So the leader of the House, for people who may not be familiar with the UK system, it's basically the government minister in Parliament. So it's the government branch in Parliament. So it's the minister from the government that makes sure that the government business goes through Parliament. But besides that, because it's a Westminster system, is very powerful because the government basically has a lot of say on the business of the House. So most of the time of the business spent in the House is government business, and there's only some exceptions which are not government business. So in the UK Parliament, if you want to do anything, basically you need to have the government to agree for you to have time for that, which is very different to at least from our continental parliaments in Europe, where the opposition has specific, divisions of that time. And so we have that tension, and yes, the leader of the House at the moment is part of those traditionalists. What was interesting though was at the beginning there was a situation of crisis, and so the leadership, which basically means the leader of the House, the government side, asked, we need to have a virtual solution. We need to do something about this, and so the staff worked really hard and presented a solution that worked really well. And actually that was working well. They even voted online for some time. I don't know if you realize that, for about a month, through a system using a digital platform that was already there, that was used for something else. They just adapted that to voting. Now, what's interesting though is that Westminster really, really feeds from the culture of people meeting each other, contacting each other, talking to each other. I know all politicians, all parliaments do, but I think Westminster is even more so like that. And as you may be aware, in Westminster also, party politics is important, but party discipline is not as strong as elsewhere. I don't know if you're aware of that. So in other parliaments, at least in Europe, party discipline is very strong, and parties MPs tend to vote together. In Westminster, it's not like that. Individual MPs, they may be part of a party, but they are also very much their own person. And the voting in the UK Parliament, again, I don't know if everyone is aware of this, but the way they vote in the UK Parliament is they go through two corridors. So they actually walk through two corridors, physically walk through two corridors, very tiny corridors where all the people get cramped in, and you basically vote, you walk through the corridor of the A, or you vote through the corridor of an A, yes or no. There's no abstention. Well, you can be, if you're absent, then you're abstaining, I suppose. And why am I saying this? Because I'm saying this because this method of voting, there's lots of people who want to change it for electronic voting, for instance. And at the Digital Democracy Commission 2015, that you mentioned at the beginning, we discussed that many times also. And the main resistance about changing that system is because that's one of the only opportunities that MPs have to talk to the ministers, to talk to people in government, because ministers in government are also MPs. So they'll go through the lobbies, and MPs, it's an opportunity to talk to them, to lobby, to talk about all sorts of things. So the ritual of voting in the UK Parliament is really important to the culture and to the business of what's happening in there. Besides that, it's also much more difficult, if you think about it, to dissent from your party, to vote against your party, if you are walking along the corridor with the members of the opposition. Whereas if you're in an app and you're just clicking the button, you don't have that pressure of the people, of seeing your mates go into different corridor. And so a lot of the interpretation of everything went virtual, but then there was a back step, was exactly that the party whips, so I don't know if you're familiar with those terms, the party whips are the people who maintain the discipline within the parties. And there's lots of roles from those. There's a chief whip, and then there's lots of junior party whips. There was very much a feeling that the party whips were losing, were losing a hand on what was happening. So who are these MPs, how they're going to vote, and that contact between MPs, that sort of informal, there's an informal space, informal conversation was just not happening. And I think that really brought, really made it clear how the virtual world was so different to the actual physical world. And that's just one example of how the massive change it was. And that's why then, they brought it back to a physical voting, which is still there today, except that now you can actually vote, you still go through to likewise corridors, but you have actually a card. You can actually just tap in and vote with that. So it doesn't take as long, but you still have to go through that. Or you have a proxy voting. So now we have a situation where the party whips, they may have a proxy voting. So proxy voting meaning that they can vote on behalf of other people. And you may have an MP who has in their hand, say, over 100 votes, because that's all the people, all the MPs who are in the country who can't travel to Westminster and can't be there to vote. And this has been very polemical, and a lot of people have very much criticized all of this scenario because it has really excluded a lot of people. There's lots of MPs who need to be shielding people, with disabilities, people going through cancer treatment. There's also been difficulties in terms of intervening in the debates. So you see all those traditionalist views actually coming through the fore here very, very, very strongly. Now, what's interesting, though, is to look at House of Lords. And I would encourage anyone to actually look at what's happening in the House of Lords. So if you say the UK House of Commons is traditionalist, then what would you say of the UK House of Lords? Even more tradition. However, they're doing electronic voting. They're voting everything electronically through an app, and they've adapted to a lot of this. So it's interesting how it's happening in one chamber and in the other chamber. You could say that in the House of Lords, because the age of the members is higher, there's even more risk for those members. And so there's even maybe more motivation to adapt virtual solutions. But yeah, I mean, sorry, I could go much more about the UK case. There's so much to say. I'll put in there the message, the link.
Sure. Sorry, because we're running out of time, I'll retract my Brazil question, although I'm very interesting to hear about. Maybe we'll talk about it later, because we have two more questions. One from the audience, from Russia, from Olisa Koketova. If I can reframe briefly her question. She asked if you can say what are some of the societal parameters or criteria that might determine whether a parliament would go virtual or not. And after that, we have a question by Klaus Heine.
So on Market to answer now?
Sorry?
Market to answer the question, yeah?
Yes, please go ahead.
There was just an echo. So on societal conditions, that's a really good point, because I think actually in terms of a parliament, so thinking specifically of a parliament becoming more digital, I think it depends more on the structures of the institution itself than necessarily of the society. So you might say that cases where there's a bigger country, there's more incentive for the parliament to become more digital because of being able to access, from further afield than people from just within the capital, which is where usually the parliament is. And of course, that does play a role, and obviously sort of the infrastructure of the country also plays a role in terms of access to broadband, etc. But if you think of, some cases in Europe where you may think, well, they have very good digital infrastructures, and then you think of cases like, for instance, in Latin America, where those infrastructure might not be there. Actually, I would say the most innovation in terms of digital is to be found in Latin America. So I think it depends more on the institution, really, rather than the societal characteristics. And then there's another question.
Yes, Klaus, please, do you want to open your mic and ask?
Yes, Cristina, first of all, thank you very much for your stimulating talk. And I have less a question, but more an observation. And that is, you used the term political leadership, and I understood it that we possibly need more political leadership, or a better one. And this coincides with what Professor Pasquale yesterday also in his keynote lecture said, with all those data analytics in the US. So now I'm not sure that I would know what political leadership exactly means. But if it would imply that we need more and better, because we have this availability of this technology, then my first reaction would be, let us go for institutions in which we need less political leadership, because the whole system becomes so, so vulnerable. And Professor Pasquale talked, he had even a picture of the former US president and the prime minister in UK there. Could you reflect on that, what you mean with political leadership, or would you also subscribe to, let us go for institutions where we have less the need of those specific personalities? Sometimes it works out, sometimes not.
Thank you, Klaus, for your question. I was referring to political leadership in a much more boring way, I'm afraid. I was just using it as a descriptive way of referring to, in Parliament, there's usually things like the Bureau, the Commission, the corporate body, those type of institutions, of committees, organizations, groups within a Parliament, and usually have the Speaker, the President of the Parliament, who are the political leadership, or the secretaries, the vice presidents, whatever they may be, but also the political groups, so the leaders of the political groups. And then the administrative leadership, which is the Secretary General, the directors of services, etc. So I was referring more to the tension between the two of them, because the political one tends to be temporary, they come and go, whereas the administrative one are the permanent ones, are the ones who tend to stay there and see these politics coming and going. Now, whether we should have better political leadership, yeah, absolutely. You know, I can't disagree with that. Should it always be just the technical administrative leadership too? I don't think so neither, because I think, you know, there needs to be a link with the voting, there needs to be a link to the public, and ultimately, whether we like the politicians or not, they're the ones who've got the legitimacy to be there. And, you know, I totally see what you're saying about the US president and UK prime minister, but ultimately they're the ones who've been elected. And if we start going completely against that, then I think that's quite dangerous. Now, can we have better political leadership? Definitely. And hopefully with elections, we get better political leaders at the next round. I'm an optimistic, so I'm always looking at, when I don't like what I see, I'm always looking at the next election.
Thank you very much, Cristina, for, as Klaus said, a very stimulating and fascinating beginning to our panel. Thank you very much. And we're moving to our second speaker, Professor Olivier Rosenberg. Olivier is Associate Professor at Sciences Po Paris within the Center of European Studies and Comparative Politics. He is member of the editorial board of the Journal of Legislative Studies and Parliamentary Affairs. He has collaborated with the European Parliament on various issues, and his research focuses on legislative studies, including parliamentary institutions, legislatures' behavior, comparative studies, on European studies, and the role of parliaments in the governance of the EU. And as Cristina mentioned, he has also done, and is still doing, research on legislators under COVID-19 specifically. And the title of his talk is The Digitalization of Legislatures, a Threat and an Opportunity. So Olivier, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ittai, for the invitation. 2 years ago, you invited me in Tel Aviv, and I would prefer to be in Tel Aviv now than in my flat, but still, it's good to do something. To start, if I can share my screen, can I? Yes, I can see it. So if we look at this a guy who is an MP from Mexico participating to a meeting, it's interesting to have the other side of the picture, which is this one. You see that he's wearing a Bermuda. So it's a way to introduce the issue on the possibility to have a genuine parliamentary life, oversight, lawmaking in parliaments, under these special circumstances, and particularly with the multiplication of remote meeting through electronic devices. So before going in details to the pros and the cons of the digital participation to Parliament, let me just show you the quick result of a comparative survey we've done with colleagues from Israel and France, including Ittai. So we compared the participation of parliaments all around the world, noting them according to two scales. One that relates to their legislative activity, from 1, no activity because of the COVID, and 10, business as usual. So it's a descriptive issue. And 1, more interesting for us today, on the use of technology, from 1, no use of technology, to 4, full use of technologies, including not only remote meetings, but also remote votes on the plenary, if we can still use the word. And well, one of the results is this one. So with the horizontal axis, you can see the first act, the first scale on the functioning of parliaments from 1 to 10, where you see that, well, parliaments generally have not been closed during the 2 weeks we took into account, which was the peak of the first wave, that as we could have expected, democracies are performing in a way better than other kinds of parliaments. But surprisingly, maybe intermediary countries in terms of democratic developments are tended to be closer than full dictatorships. That's something we explain with our colleagues through the fact that within this intermediary group, legislatures can be more a threat for the authoritarian leader than in full dictatorship. Moreover, closing a legislature within a dictatorship because of the COVID means that you recognize publicly the severity of the disease, which some authoritarian leaders wanted to avoid. If we look now at the second scale, so the vertical axis, we see first and more importantly a moderate use of technologies, since the scale was from 1 to 4. So you see that the countries or the regions are located from 1 to 2.5. So the full possibility of remote participation have not been used, with some exceptions like Chile or Wales, but few exceptions. You see as well that democracies tended to use more electronic devices, which could partly be resulting from difference in terms of wealth of the countries, but probably not only, because if you look at the classification, the positioning regions by region, you see that, for instance, countries from South America or Oceania are performing better in terms of use of technology than Asia or North America. So there are seemingly some places where there is a capacity to use electronic devices or to develop experimentations, whatever these experimentations are. We developed some regression models in order to understand the reason for explanatory factors for the functioning of parliaments, and we include the use of technologies as an independent variable. And the result is null. So the capacity to use technology was not a source of a factor for keeping open parliamentary activity, with a few exceptions within in the intermediary group, the one which is called moderate democracy, within some countries of Latin America, for instance, that used the possibility to use technologies to avoid closure, but it's rather an exception. Now, if we leave this quantitative big picture more generally, I think that what we've seen with the crisis and with the development of digitalization after it was moderate, the kind of trade-off between lawmaking and oversight. It's been difficult for many legislators to do properly their lawmaking activities for legal reasons, because there was some emergency, some fast-track procedures, etc. But also probably for political reasons, when question of life and death are at stake, it's difficult to do what Parliament do, which is to take the time to discuss, to oppose views, etc. But the thing I want to stress is that to a large extent, this decline has been compensated by dynamisms of the kinds of oversight in Parliament worldwide, with a diversity of procedures that are often more flexible than the lawmaking procedure, of course, and that offer possibility of remote use. I also have the feeling that in some cases, well, MPs were here, they were elected, they were at their home as we were, as academics or practitioners, and they wanted to be useful, they wanted to do something. So oversight activities were also developed in order to feed this pressure from them to be active and well, if not influential, at least to participate to a major crisis. Let me give you two examples of that. The first one is Canada. So you see that after huge debates within the House of Commons, it has been decided to transform the whole assembly into a special committee, and this committee functioning on a hybrid way with virtual and physical participation, which was the case here when Prime Minister Trudeau was here. It's a bit the same that arrived within the French Parliament. You see here the French Prime Minister at that time, in 1st of April, being heard by the Speaker of the Parliament, and only him in person. But behind him, you have this screen with all the committee chairs and the group chairs who question this Prime Minister for more than 3 hours, knowing, so we were the 1st of April, knowing that it was the very peak of the crisis. So it was really simultaneous, this capacity of the legislative power to obtain answers, to ask questions to the head of the executive power, which is not negligible to me. I mention that because there is a kind of music nowadays in the literature and in the press, knowing that it's saying that it's a defeat of Parliament, that they have been ineffective, etc. We find a capacity of adaptation. This being said, let me come to the heart of my presentation about the use of virtual tools by parliaments. And I like to start with the pros, because the cons are obvious. You know, parliaments are by definition or have been a physical place. So when you start to organize remote meetings, well, it's obvious that it will raise challenges and issues. But there are, to me, yet some opportunities that I like to stress. First, the fact that it's still possible to have a kind of accountability process through Zoom, through electronic devices, to ask questions, tough questions from ministers, to obtain answers from them, to disagree, etc., which is not negligible. And this can be broadcasted online, etc. So there can be a public for these exchanges. So the heart of the parliamentary matrix, the pluralist oral debates where people disagree, is still possible from remote devices. Second point, I have heard with interest the counterexample of Brazil developed by Cristina, but I have yet the feeling that when it's not necessary anymore to be within the same physical place to talk, which is the case with electronic devices, then in that case, there is a possibility for MP, non-parliamentarians, to have a role, to ask questions, and why not maybe to talk from time to time. Representative of private interest, of NGOs, etc., that could participate to virtual hybrid forums with MPs and non-MPs. And to me, this is positive for a pure reason, which is not reason of opinion, but rather of fact, which is the lack of popularity of public support of parliaments worldwide nowadays. This is so severe that we cannot just pretend that it does not exist. And if there is a possibility to put closer, well, people on the representative, to put it like that, then it should be considered seriously. Two other positive possibilities that I mentioned quickly. Maybe one day the possibility to have automatic translation within diverse languages. The European Parliament is developing tests for that. It's not easy, but once you use well, electronic devices to communicate, you have this possibility to have automatic translation and to understand more easily each other, which could be, of course, an asset in multicultural parliaments, and there are few, not only the European Parliament, as you know. Fourth point, which is important within the European Union, which is a possibility to ease the communication between regional, national parliaments and the European parliaments, and even local parliaments. So the so-called multi-level parliamentarism could be easier through electronic devices. And it could also be fairer in the sense that it's often organized by the European Parliament, which control the process. Things being said, it's obvious that there are some cons that are obvious, so I will mention them briefly. First, less colorful debates. And colorful debates are interesting not only for the taste of the show, but also because we know that they participate to the deliberative quality of the debate, to the accountability process, that there are tools to that end. And well, if parliamentary debates became boring, that's an issue for democratic supporters. Secondly, probably the fact that there are less pressures on the shoulder of a minister once she's questioned online than within the setting of the building, where the body matter, where it's not possible for advisors to give papers, etc. So it's easier, but the accountability process in that sense is a bit lighter online. Third, there are possibilities of free ridings for MPs being online, for instance, through pretending to participate to a meeting and switching off the camera so that we cannot see that they do 3 meetings simultaneously, that they attend the meeting for 5 minutes and then do something else and put their parliamentary assistant instead, etc. Well, those are concrete but very serious issues when we know how parliaments function and the pressure on the agenda of MPs. And it's of course an issue because parliaments is a place where we know who sit and who decide for what. If there is this uncertainty on the identity of the participants to a meeting, it's a democratic issue. Fourth, it has been raised this year and last year in many articles that there is an issue of inequality when you have hybrid meetings, inequality in terms of gender, belonging to minority, to MPs elected from the capital where the building of the parliament is, or elected from remote places. Because obviously those who sit within the room have a better opportunity to speak and to develop their views than those who are present remotely. And the division between those who assist, who attend, and those who do not, who attend virtually, well, it's not MPs are not equal towards the capacity to participate. Fourth, well, when you have virtual meeting, you have the possibility to cut the micro or to cut the camera for the MP, but also for the chair of the meeting. And my point is easy. It's to say that it's easier for the chair of a virtual meeting to cut the video or to cut the micro than to shut an MP who want to speak during an in-person meeting. And it's an issue because very often the speaker, the leader of a meeting belongs to the majority, so it raises the issue of the right of the opposition with remote devices. Last element, which has been mentioned by Cristina and also by someone who is both an academic and a practitioner that we all know, Philip Norton, the fact that parliamentary influence is a lot about informal meetings, informal talks within the corridors, and with full digitalization, this is more difficult. This is not impossible, by the way, because the rapporteur or the chair of the committee can still meet informally, having in-person informally, when having remote formal meetings. But of course, it's more difficult, especially for backbenchers. To conclude, I think that through some important philosophical questions are raised by the possible virtualization of the parliaments, but also very concrete issues that are raised, and we see it today. How can e-meetings can be more lively? What should be kept non-virtual within the lawmaking procedure? How can we control if an MP is behind the screen or not? Should MPs have a monopoly of speeches during their meeting? And who is controlling Zoom? I think that there should be an academic, democratic, and as well a parliamentary debate on this issue. And to finish, I just mentioned you my preliminary views on that, just to feed the debate. Well, maybe we could make the parliamentary meeting more lively with new buttons, with new options like applause, shout, the requirement of 20 seconds interruption. I don't know, imagination can work. What should be kept non-virtual? To me, it's important to have within the lawmaking procedures some steps that where in-person discussion is needed. Should it be within committee or within plenary? Well, I guess it depends on the parliamentary culture of a given parliament. For France and the UK, I think plenary, some parts of the plenary would be needed to be kept non-virtual. For the Knesset and the Bundestag, maybe it's the committees to be discussed. Who is behind the screen? To me, it's an important question. And we know that within parliaments, clerks have in many parliaments, the Knesset, for instance, which is one of the most dynamic in that aspect, clerks have the duty to say who is attending and who is not attending, who is within the meeting and even in the Knesset, within the building or not. So I guess it would be possible to do it as well for virtual participation of MPs, with a possibility for clerks to control if they are behind the screen. So it raises issue of private liberties. I'm aware of that, but you know, MPs are not people like over, and we really need to be sure if it's them or if it's not them who are voting, for instance. Monopoly of MPs over speeches. An interesting proposal could be to have during the lawmaking procedure one stages which is done remotely, electronically, which is open to citizens or NGOs or even lobbies participation, where they can also give their view publicly through Zoom or other devices. And last issue, who is controlling the devices? I think in the future we will see a development of the regulations within the standing orders of the parliaments, very precise regulations, as we have now precise regulations for physical meetings. So very precise regulations on remote participation, when the micro can be cut, when the image can be cut, when it's allowed to interrupt or not to interrupt someone, etc. So future work for legal scholars, which is a good news for you, Ittai. And I've done.
Thank you very much, Olivier, for this excellent presentation. We have a question from Everett. I'll just say something based on the Q&As, that not a question, but a comment from the editors of the International Journal of Parliamentary Studies, that they will soon publish an analysis on how online tools in the UK Parliament were used by MP groups, and including gender, party, etc. And I think it fits very nicely into what you said, questions about how does it impact gender. I could also mention that I think your point about will it give even more power to the chair, and will it enable to marginalize the opposition, is a very big question. And I can say that I know of already one study done about Poland, that they moved into virtual mode, and this study claimed that although in theory it's very good and it's important to keep Parliament working, in practice it was used by the majority to make sure that even more legislative standards are being, as they call it, quarantined as well, and the opposition is getting even less rights. So I think these are very interesting questions. I would say that one more question that you raised that I think it would be very interesting to check in follow-up studies, you know, we'll need to wait more, is how does it impact public perceptions of Parliament? And this of course feeds into Cristina's work as well, but you mentioned correctly that one of the tragedies that all legislative scholars agree upon is that on the one hand, it is the most legitimate and democratic institution. On the other hand, it has a crisis of public appreciation. And the question whether digital will enable more engagement and therefore more public appreciation or vice versa is a very good question that we hope that maybe follow-up studies will be able to show. So I'm sending to the panelists and attendees the citations I mentioned, and Everett, if you want to ask your questions, so please go ahead and open your mic.
Thanks, Ittai. Thank you very much, Olivier, for your interesting presentation. My question was triggered by your slide with the cons and the pros, and I wonder whether I talk about a conditional pro or a non-conditional con. We know from, let's say, various worldwide institutes like the Institute for Democracy and so forth, that parliaments have to struggle in order to, let's say, preserve their credibility and also their acceptance of their voting and their decision-making procedures, have to struggle with, let's say, undue allegiances to business world, pressure groups or whatever. So let's say the lobbyists of all kinds. And you say in one way, the digitalization may open the floor for, let's say, transparent lobbyism, by saying we can give a floor to NGOs or others who want to have a say in the items on the agenda. That is so, I can accept that, but I was wondering whether, in what way, how would you feel considering the difficulty that parliaments already experience for, let's say, proper regulation and achieving a transparency in party financing and all those kinds of things. You know what I'm talking about. Would digitalization not lead to a further, let's say, pushing this outside of the view of the camera? And therefore, let's say, it's with the physical parliaments, it's already almost impossible to have transparency. But would a digital parliament even be more worse in that respect? What would be your observation on this issue of transparency? Because that is considered to be the best weapon against undue allegiances and undue influence. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a tough question. And also, if I may, a bit of French question, because usually the French political culture is supposed to be very adverse to lobbying. Well, the point I wanted to make was the fact that the monopoly of pre-legal speeches, speeches before the decision on law, the monopoly of MPs was more and more difficult to maintain, because society has changed, because there is a crisis of legitimacy, etc. And I think we can both still support Parliament, as I do. I think it's a great institution, etc. But consider that this monopoly is a claim that cannot be supported anymore, and that it's good to have a kind of meeting or forum, compulsory one, during the lawmaking stage, where all the speakers can give their views, representative of interest, experts, etc. And if we think at the French philosopher Bruno Latour, also representative of non-human actors, trees, nature, etc. Human beings speaking in the name of trees and on nature, etc. I think it can help to make clear what are the interests and the economic interest at stake. What is the position of, for instance, major car companies on the debate, etc., and to see their connections or similarities between their views and the views of some MPs. So maybe in that sense, it could put some transparency on the lobbying process, but I also tend to think that it won't, the virtualization won't change much of the whole process. I've listened this week to a seminar by Paul Pearson on the money put in the US election and the influence of the decision taken by the US Congress. And it's so much money in the end that I suspect that, be the meeting virtual or in person, it would not change so much the process.
Thank you very much, Olivier. Unfortunately, we're out of time and we need to move on, but thank you so much for a great presentation, which I think is also a perfect segue from Cristina's more general theoretical talk to our last speakers, who will give a specific case study and give us some data about what they found in their study. So our final speakers are Professor Evert Stemhouse and Lianne van Kalken. Professor Evert Stemhouse holds the chair for Law and Innovation at the Erasmus School of Law and is a senior fellow at the Jean Monnet Center for Excellence on Digital Governance. He also holds the chair for Criminal Law and Procedure at the University of Aruba, and this is why we all envy him all the time. And he serves as an appellate judge in the Netherlands. His research focuses on international and European criminal justice, national procedural reform, comparative criminal justice and cyber safety, as well as on disruptive technological change in regulation and practice in the public domain. Lianne van Kalken is a lecturer and PhD student at the Erasmus School of Law. She conducts both legal and public administration research for the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Kingdom Relations in cooperation with Leiden University. She is also a leader of the Green Party in the local council of Vlaardingen, I hope I pronounced it correctly, and the research focuses on coalition formation and on local democracies. And the title of their talk will be Digital Equals Public, the Dutch Emergency Legislation for Local Democracy in COVID-19 Lockdown. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ittai. Good afternoon, everyone. I will today presenting our paper to you. I wrote a paper for the European Journal of Law Reform together with Professor Evert Stemhuis. We would like to thank the organization for the opportunity to present our work today. Karen will show my slides, so maybe you can...
Yeah, we see them.
Yes, okay, thank you. Yes, the next slide, please. The paper we wrote, we examined the emergency legislation for local democracy in the Netherlands. In response to the coronavirus pandemic, also in the Netherlands, the Emergency Act law for digital meetings for local democracy was enacted. The Dutch legislator introduced the option of digital debate and decision-making for, among others, municipal and provincial councils, the democratically elected assemblies at the local and regional levels, because in the permanent legislation, it was only possible to have physical meetings. And on the left side, you see the act. It's in Dutch, so you can read it, but it's signed by our king, Willem-Alexander. And on the right side, you see me as a chairperson in the local council, because we are still debating digital. At the same time, the Ministry of the Interior and Kingdom Relations set up an evaluation committee, and this committee is created to monitor and evaluate how local and provincial governments work with the temporary legislation. The case Professor Stimhuis and I study in our paper is the design and structure of the legislation and the evaluation of the legislation. And the purpose of the legislation is to create possibilities for local representatives in the context of the lockdown in response to the coronavirus pandemic. From our analysis of the futures of the legislation and the effects on the political work of the representatives, we draw more general lessons about the effects of the legislation for local democracy. Next slide, please. We have 3 sections in our paper, and in the second section of our paper, we describe the content of the temporary act. The Dutch legislator gave high priority of the continuation of deliberation and decision-making of the assemblies of elected representatives. The bodies under the act are the 355 municipalities of the Netherlands, the 12 provinces, the special bodies for the 3 small islands in the Caribbean that do not have autonomous status, Bonaire, Sint Eustatius and Saba, and the 22 water authorities, Waterschap. They are a product of recognized functional decentralization with deep roots in Dutch history. The statutory publicity requirement can be fulfilled according to the Act when the meeting in the digital environment can be followed by the population real time, but remotely, that is by way of live video connecting. Minimum requirements for a digital meeting to qualify as such are the following. First of all, every member has access to the deliberation and voting. Secondly, every member's identity is visibly and audibly verifiable by the chairperson, the co-members and the public. And finally, the chairperson is capable of maintaining order on the floor and of deciding on the sequence of the voting items. The Act arranges for immediate entry into force after publication of the Act and for a fixed end of force. That fixed end can, according to the second sentence of Article 7.1, be postponed by way of royal decree, each time for a maximum period of 2 months. The Act is in the meantime extended 3 times. The Act thus carries a sunset clause in order to express the temporary nature of the whole arrangement. A royal decree is a decision given by the government and signed by the monarch. In the Dutch legal tier system, it is ranked between the decision of an individual minister and the decrees that require involvement of parliament. In order to remain within the technocratic usage of time limits, a reference to the pandemic in the arrangement for postponement and an inclusion of the discussion of the evaluation reports in Parliament by way of a procedural provision would have been consistent. However, the Act neither contains any criterion for the decision to postpone the fixed end, nor a procedural requirement to involve Parliament in the decision and discuss the reports of the Evaluation Committee in Parliament before an extension is decided. This blank competency allows for the extraordinary provision to still be in force long after the current crisis is overcome without parliamentary consent. It may turn out that nothing is as permanent as this temporary measure. We point at an important safeguard. A fortunate counterbalancing mechanism against this shortcoming is found in the fact that the relevant assemblies are independent as to whether and for how long they are used the exceptional digital platform. but we are not certain how this will play out in future practice. Next slide, please. Yeah. In the third section, we describe the results of the 2 reports of the evaluation committee, and the first report focused on the facts and figures regarding the use of the temporary act by local governments. In the majority of the municipalities, 88%, provinces, 92%, and water authorities, 65%, digital meetings took place by mid-May. In November, it was around 90%. There have been no digital meetings conducted by the Island Council in the Caribbean in April and May. In 2/3 of the municipalities, decisions have been made during the digital council meetings. This number is higher, 3/4 in the provinces and water authorities. When we summarize the results, we can conclude that there is a positive response in the field. The statement, "it works, but it is not ideal," sums up the opinion of the clerks. It is found a good alternative during this corona pandemic, but there are all sorts of disadvantages. Representatives miss the contact and interaction that are normally there during physical meetings. Debating is more difficult, and the digital meetings are experienced as more intense and tiring. Managing and guiding the digital meetings is difficult for most chairpersons, especially when technology is ailing or failing. In the second report, the evaluation committee discussed also the impact of the use of the temporary act on relation relevant for the political process. According to the second report, it is now clear that the representatives themselves experience considerable limitation in their role as councillor, where they want to fulfill their 3-fold constitutional functions. The 3-fold constitutional functions are: 1, setting the framework for the administration; secondly, controlling that administration; and thirdly, representing the people. The Act makes it possible for the representatives to deliberate and to make decisions in local democracy, but that does not equal democracy for its entirety. The committee encountered a level of frustration with elected representatives about the limitations of the digitalization for the wider interaction with their local communities. However, it should be too short-sighted to blame digital conferencing for this. The lack of contact with the supporters is not primarily a result of digital meetings, but more of the corona crisis and the crisis measures in general. The threat to local democracy lies in the virus and not in this temporary act, according to us. Next sheet, please. In the last section of our paper, we wrote some recommendations. 1, we have shown in section 2 that the text of the Act would not prevent the extension clause in the Act, but it would effectively suspend a statute without the mandatory parliamentary consent. An important aspect of local regional democracy would be affected by such a course of action. It would be more consistent with the Dutch statutory rules for local regional government to insert the desirable digital component in the relevant statutes, which would entail parliamentary consent. According to us, there should be an evaluation that is not driven by the crisis, but delves into the pros and cons of the shift from personal deliberation and decision-making before an audience to digitalization. Secondly, democracy is in COVID-19 circumstances more than just the exchange of substantive points of view and then voting in a digital meeting. We recommend the actors that are in the position to do so to communicate clearly about the limited ambitions of the digitalization in its present form. In addition, the other forms of interaction should be accommodated and incentivized to the extent possible while observing social distancing. We advise the platform Democracy in Action to act as a useful forum for exchange and development of good practices. The outcome of our paper shows us the following fact and fiction. Fact, the virus is a threat to local democracy in all its aspects. Fiction, digital instruments can repair this threat. A mix of fact and fiction can be found in the risk for the open debate when the exception is extended too long beyond the crisis and more or less abused by the majority to silence the opposition. So that was our presentation. Maybe the next sheet. If there are any questions, you can ask them, of course.
Thank you very much, Leanne, for this great presentation and for giving us the perspective of an in-depth case study that gives already in this stage some feedbacks from the field of how people actually experienced it. So I think it has a very important perspective. I'll just start with perhaps two brief comments and then we'll open it to questions. That I found it very interesting that it was done through sunset decree by the government and not by legislation and without parliamentary approval. There's an interesting anecdote from Colombia, where also the government had a governmental decree that allowed online or virtual meetings of all bodies of government, and Parliament started, even the federal Parliament started using virtual solutions by the authority of this decree, and the Constitutional Court in fact intervened and said it's unconstitutional for Parliament to go virtual based on a governmental decree. So I think it was very interesting to see this relationship, and I, of course, also very much agree with your recommendations that in the long run, it should be something that is done through statutory intervention, and Parliament should be involved. So this is was my brief comment, and maybe a question. You said that, and I agree again, the virus is actually the threat, and digital could be part of the solution, but then you correctly said that you need to rethink about it without the emergency. So now if you would have, the carte blanche, and how would you recommend doing it, not as an emergency mode, but more as a more permanent feature of local democracy? What would you change or what would you recommend?
Well, I can say something about it. We had a discussion also in the Netherlands to have a permanent version of the act in the law system, and I think it's good to make it possible for municipalities and for local councillors as myself to always have the option to have meetings digital. So, but there is a question in how you should do that. So how is it possible to have digital meetings? When is it an option? Is it only in a crisis situation, or also is it always an option to have digital meetings? We have the discussion because I see as a local councillor that, it's also it gives opportunities to have digital meetings. You can have your laptop here and do it from your home, and that's easy. But we also have colleagues of mine who are in Spain or something, and I think that's also can be a threat for local democracy, because it's good to be in a meeting place where you have to go through and where you can say things about your city, for example. But so I think in crisis situation, it's good to have the opportunity to have digital meetings. And I think also for the people, it can be a good opportunity to be in, it's easier to be in local democracy, to have their opinions there. So yeah, I think it's a discussion how wide you have to make it possible to have digital meetings.
Can I just add a couple of very brief observations to what Lianne already said? Particularly also regarding the first observation of you, Ittai. Well, what worries us, and we write a bit about that in our paper, and after reconsideration of it, we only found more strength to this, is that a fair discussion of the instrument is actually, it's no longer possible, because it was accepted at very early stage of the COVID pandemic in the Netherlands. So let's say, Parliament is now making life for the government much more difficult than it did at that time. It was, you know, crisis everywhere, and you can see, and we've referred to that in our paper, the video footage of a Senate member saying, yeah, we did have a proper debate, but oh, it's only temporary legislation. You know, the political use of the temporary nature of the legislation. Okay, so for now we accept, right? But now that it's there, and the let's say the central parliamentarians do not use it, is for the local democracy, and there is evidence from the evaluation committee that local opposition parties experience some, let's say some restrictions with respect to whether they have influence in the meeting and whether they have enough time to speak, etc., those kinds of objections. But those objections are no longer heard in the parliament on the central level, where the decision is made whether or not we are going to extend this kind of practices and insert them into the statute. So let's say a fair evaluation and a fair discussion of it would require much more time, because at the moment this is something you can hardly be against, right? So because it works. And if anything works in the crisis circumstances, we're so happy that finally something works. So we're going to continue it. And so we see already the build-up of an argument. We should continue this and put it then into a statute. So parliamentary consent is then safeguarded. But a fair debate with arguments against it should come from those who do not participate in that debate, because that objections come from the local councillors of the opposition. Right, so this is one of the worries that we have with regard to, let's say, the involvement of the decision-making process, those that are really affected by the decision. Yep. And normally, if we would have had more time and it was not a crisis-induced decision, this kind of discussions would have taken place with impact and with a contribution from the local to the central level by hearings and commissions and those kinds of mechanisms. But we didn't have it right now. It was enacted in 25 days, right? So this is an additional observation and an additional worry to your observation and to what Lianne already said. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're almost out of time for our panel, but I would give the opportunity to all panelists if they want to add closing remarks. You're welcome to do so. Olivier and Cristina, do you want to add anything?
I can just say that one thing that we haven't really discussed very much, obviously, here is things like polarization of the public discourse and some of those extra forces that actually are of very little control from the institutions we're talking about. And obviously that's also a dimension that needs to be taken into account. You know, how do you deal with those from within the institutions when, you know, in some of the cases we're looking at, they're actually the main key players. So if we go back to the case of Brazil that we talked about earlier, in many ways, it doesn't really matter what the institutional parliament does, because a lot of the discussion, a lot of the narratives, they're taking place in WhatsApp, in closed groups, which then can manipulate a lot of the information. And for instance, when Bolsonaro was elected, there is actually evidence now and research coming out showing that a lot of those external groups were manipulating those discussions within WhatsApp and with no control whatsoever from the actual institution. So, I mean, I'm not proposing any solution. I'm just raising the issue that is a massive factor that really these institutions can't do much about, and I think is a real problem.
Olivier, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, something I'd like to add, which is we tend to consider a bit obviously that there would be a kind of opposition of legislators vis-à-vis local or national power. But what we've seen during the crisis is that very often the ministers have to make tough decisions, like closing shops or even forbidding to go in the streets, etc. And not always, but in some cases, the parliament has been, parliaments have been an asset for them to obtain some kind of legitimization around these kind of difficult decisions. So if we seek reasons to be optimistic, this is one, the fact that Parliament, because of its pluralist feature, because also, as Cristina said, it is something quite settled in the mind of the people. Parliament can be useful not only for the accountability process, but for the legitimation one.
Thank you very much, Evert and Lianne. Do you want to conclude? Do you want to add anything? Evert, you're on. Yeah.
Excuse me, I was trying to type an answer to one of the questions in the Q&A, so I was not super focused on Olivier's intervention. My apologies.
So you're welcome to say it out loud instead of typing it if you want.
Yeah, it is a question of Ms. Kochetkova, which refers to the qualifications that we use in our title. And I was just explaining, but I will continue typing afterwards if I have time. If you leave this open long enough, let's say the qualifications in our title were more or less a playful references to the public requirement that is clearly statutory laid down in the specific statutes for municipal and provincial and water board government, and the digital as a reference to the, let's say, the technology neutral approach that the temporary act takes in saying you can have video conferencing, right? So in no way other than, let's say, 3 simple requirements, no matter how you achieve it, but online, just achieve it, real-time access, recognizable by the public and by your co-members, and a possibility for the chair to have an appropriate meeting with appropriate order and appropriate voting procedures. Full stop. And that's what we try to summarize in the sort of the digital, but we could have used the word online as well. So it was in that way a bit a playful use of the categories, and I think that is a response to Ms. Kochetkova's intervention, for which I thank her very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So I want to thank all the panelists for this excellent panel and their wonderful presentations. Our next panel on online courts during COVID-19 and beyond will begin on 4 p.m. Israel time. And meanwhile, go ahead and take a cup of coffee or something, and we'll meet back at 4. Thank you very much to you all.